Well, welcome to the 10th and final episode of the Arctic Resilience Forum 2020, hosted by the Icelandic Chairmanship of the Arctic Council and organized by the Sustainable Development Working Group of the Arctic Council and the Arctic Initiative here at the Harvard Kennedy School. My name is Joel Clement, and this week's episode is focused on one of the most important challenges in Arctic resilience: how to ensure that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous knowledge holders are not only respected, but are full participants and leaders in the co-production of knowledge in the Arctic. Many of you know that there's been slow but substantial progress toward respecting and honoring Indigenous knowledge in Western science and political systems. So that's something, but frankly, it's not something to be proud of. After all the depredations brought on by colonization, the shameful disrespect and inhumanity that was and is still in some cases involved in occupying and taking over Indigenous lands, to say that, hey, at least we respect your knowledge it seems to me inadequate and insulting. So this session is about developing a roadmap toward co-production of knowledge and ensuring that the most experienced players, to use a soccer metaphor, are back on the field of play. Here at the Kennedy School, I led a study group on this topic this semester, and let me say that the nuance is beguiling, to say the least. So we have an extraordinary and experienced group of speakers who, after some framing remarks, will participate in a talking circle format. And this is challenging online, but this is going to be fantastic. So let's get started with this session on knowledge systems working together. But first, the usual list of housekeeping items. First, if you missed any of the other sessions of the forum, you can find the recorded videos on the Sustainable Development Working Group website. Brittany's putting that link up in the chat for you. Second, and this is important because we have two languages spoken today. There's an interpretation button in the lower right. Click on that and choose your language. You'll also see the Q&A button at the bottom. Ask your questions anytime. Type them in there. They will be directed to the moderators at the appropriate time. Doesn't matter if it's during the talking circle or not. They won't interrupt that, but those questions will go to the speakers at the right time. Also, if you don't get your questions answered, and hopefully we'll get to them all, but if not, you received a link to a Slack channel when you registered for the session. You can go on that Slack channel and keep the conversation going. And one last thing, please do stay tuned for the concluding remarks, where we'll tell you what comes next for the Resilience Forum now that the session's over and this remarkable community of practice that has sprung up. So let's get started. Let me introduce today's moderators. Norma Shorty is Tlingit. She has a PhD in Indigenous Studies. She teaches for Yukon University and Camel Sun College and works with the Council of Yukon First Nation. She's the mother of one grown daughter. Andrei Petrov is president of the International Arctic Social Sciences Association and director of the Arctic Center at the University of Northern Iowa. So take it away, Norma and Andrei. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. Thank you, everyone. Just a couple of words of what's to come. So today we have a very special meeting because we're not only talking about Indigenous knowledge, not about co-production, but also trying to use methodologies that are appropriate for that. I just wanted to share with you that we have a talking circle format that Norma will explain in a few minutes, but we have to remember, of course, and as many speakers today will testify, that Indigenous knowledge provides a foundation, of course, for individual and collective well-being of past, present, and future generations of Arctic Indigenous peoples. This knowledge systems calls inherent values, methodologies, functions, validation processes, but most importantly, lack of equitable engagement that Joel referred to with Indigenous knowledge in the Arctic leads to distorted and unscientific understandings of the natural and social system in the Arctic. And that's why it's so important that we work together in the Arctic, that we have a journey that leads us to concrete and successful steps in respecting, sustaining, and engaging Indigenous knowledge systems. So with that, I guess I give floor to Norma for the prayer.
Yes. Thank you. I'd like to also welcome everyone to this very important session. And as we always do in Indigenous country, we begin all of our deliberations with prayer. And even though we are online and we're not in a room together, in spirit, we are together. And I wanted to offer a prayer, as we always do. So Hashagenya, Gunakchi Shiyidishi. We ask humbly for your blessing, and we ask for your blessing on all of the people that are partaking in this wonderful endeavor. We ask for your guidance and your healing hands in everything that we do. In your name, Ha'ankau Gunakchi Shiyidishi. Amen.
Thank you, Norma. So we will have right now a demonstrated special video created by Indigenous leaders and science leaders for this session. Then we'll have two keynote presentations by Norma and Chief Vyacheslav Shadrin from Yakutia, and then we're going to have the talking circle. This is just the general. So at any point, please, put your questions in Q&A, and we'll read them when they come. And as a panel, and the panelists are ready to respond, then we'll put the questions together. So please, if we could show the intro video.
Indigenous knowledge undergirds our cultural identity and cultural integrity, and it has both historic and ancestral strands critical to our future generations. Indigenous knowledge encompasses a vast array of elements, including history, language, oral traditions, philosophy, food security, and kinship, among other elements. Indigenous knowledge goes to the heart of understanding the biodiversity of our ecosystems, plants, flora, and fauna, all the things that sustain us. More significantly, Indigenous knowledge also embraces the profound relationship that we have with our Arctic homelands and territories, both lands and the marine environment. Consistent with the ICC principles and elements for a comprehensive Arctic policy, we have acknowledged that Inuit knowledge and scientific research are both valid systems of knowledge that should be recognized and harmonized within the context of research. For decades, in the name of science, actions have been taken that ultimately disrespect or exploit Indigenous knowledge or take it out of context for other purposes. Therefore, others must recognize and respect our rights in a comprehensive fashion as they relate to Indigenous knowledge. And others must have the patience to understand our concerns and work to establish the relationships needed to nurture genuine trust. Once trust, respect, and recognition are established, we will then have the space to manifest the ethical and equitable engagement of Indigenous knowledge holders and Indigenous knowledge. Only in this way we will create an environment that allows for the real co-production.
Many important leaders in the Arctic Indigenous communities have long played important roles in advancing Arctic science and engineering. In Western science, university researchers and government scientists are indebted to these individuals for the wisdom and insights they have shared. This has made our efforts more efficient, our field studies safer, and helps society come to understand and value the Arctic as a critically important region in the global system. The Arctic is important as a system. People are also an integral component of that system. They're not just living on the surface or watching it from afar, but are intertwined with the plants, animals, weather, and terrain. They are not just another aspect to be studied, but are the heartbeat of the system. They evolve with the changing climate. They adapt to the changing seasons and the available resources. They are the echo of the land, but they are also the vision of the future.
Arctic is home to diverse Indigenous cultures and languages that tremendously differ from each other, that have developed their own unique technologies and Indigenous knowledge systems that advance their lives on their homelands. The key concept that unites Arctic Indigenous peoples, however, is the reciprocal relation to the nature, is the ability to give back to nature, not to take more than is needed. And this is the core of sustainability in the Arctic. This has been the driving force of the healthy communities and healthy Arctic environments.
Collaboration between indigenous people, indigenous knowledge, and Western science is especially important. Indigenous knowledge provides a foundation for individual and collective resilience of past, present, and future generations of Arctic indigenous peoples. And it empowers communities to make self-determined choices and define their own paths to Arctic sustainability building.
The possession of indigenous knowledge, according to Nenets themselves, has a great value because it can save the life. In tundra, it's very important to have different abilities and skills. A child, when he is or she is finished with education, supposed to become attain, which means to have a great mind based on experience. At the same time, today, they must learn the capacity to adapt quickly because tundra life is changing, but also the climate is changing. But we also should listen to women which are living in tundra today and still helping their husbands to protect and develop reindeer herding.
In 1994, there was a meeting on traditional ecological knowledge of the predecessor of the Arctic Council. My fellow natural scientists, they were arguing traditional knowledge is not real knowledge, just anecdotes, histories. Today, science works closely with the indigenous peoples, and we see many, many good examples of better collaboration. The future may bring even a better form of collaboration between the people on the land, the people who have the history, and the science communities. We have learned that working together helps. We have learned that working together create new and better questions, and it creates new knowledge that nobody have been thinking of before. Let's hope that the future will be totally different from the one I met 30 years ago.
Well, that was a very, very inspiring video. So now I think we go into the second segment of the session, which our two distinguished speakers, Norma Shorty and Chief Vyacheslav Shadrin, will share their thoughts on the indigenous knowledge co-production. So without further delay, I give the floor to Norma. If you want to also introduce yourself in your ways that you feel appropriate, that will be great as well. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andre. My name is Norma Shorty. My Tlingit name is Yeskechon Tukasach. I am an inland Tlingit from Teslin, Yukon. I'm deeply affiliated and connected to the Tlingits in Alaska. So as Tlingit people, there's a border, but it's not a border that we recognize. My mother is Emma Shoran, and that determines who I am. That determines my identity. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a little bit about my work in the area of sustaining Indigenous knowledges. I am an educator. I've been working in the area of education for probably over 40 years. I started out as a sort of a junior, a CELC, a community education liaison coordinator for our people many years ago, and from that time have kind of gotten in deeper. So now I do train teachers who are new to the system on how to work with Indigenous knowledges and and how to blend Western and Indigenous worldviews so that they make sense, and not to overlay them, and not to sort of make one try to be like the other. So part of my work is writing papers. And so, you know, who am I and what has been my work? So I graduated from the University of Alaska Fairbanks in 2015. And from 2015 to 2018 is when I did some of my most prominent work, which was with Tlingit elders in Juneau, Alaska. And that was towards defining Tlingit history and curriculum for ourselves and for institutions of public learning. So before 2015, I worked in education, like I was saying, in high schools, elementary schools, day camps, elder and youth camps, language camps, and culture camps. And today I work with the University of the Yukon and the Yukon Native Teacher Education Program, and for Camosun College as a teacher, and the Council of Yukon First Nations as a curriculum developer for Indigenous family support programs and other programs like that. And I'm also a cultural expert to the Sustainable Working Group, and I've been nominated to sit on that table by Arctic Athabascan Council here in the Yukon. So with regard to sustaining Indigenous knowledges with the elders I worked with 30 Tlingit elders in Juneau. So that's significant only because there were 30 of them, and they came from all walks of life, were at varying ages, had varying levels of fluency and Western education and language. So one of the things, our task was to build curriculum on their boarding school experiences. And later we developed curriculum for social studies, science, and math. And all of these were for public school and for our own high school academies and more. So at the beginning of the project, English thoughts and languages were dominant. But after 2 years of working together, Tlingit language and Tlingit culture dominated the English constructs. The elder-led research tables addressed Indigenous constructs and language and histories and stories and more. So all of this stuff began to make more sense within the construct of being Tlingit rather than looking at it through the lens of a researcher. So when we thought about sustaining Indigenous knowledges in things like renewable economies, you know, we asked ourselves, what do we think about solar energy, wind energy, geothermal pressure, wood, water, oxygen, fish, and precious metals? So each of these things, we found that we had stories that basically lent to concepts of sustainability. So when we think about solar energy, we think about stories such as the raven giving birth to the sun, the moon, and the stars. And in our own Indigenous way, we know that the raven's demand for the sun, moon, and stars produced the sun, moon, and stars, and for an ever increasing population, the humans, which was us. This raven story also tells listeners how long the Tlingit have been in the area. And this is since the beginning of time, since the birth of the sun, moon, and stars, which pushes against, you know, the Burundian land theory. So since the time of written history, Tlingit knowledges have been overshadowed by settler histories and ideas. And when we think about sustaining Indigenous knowledges in human research, I think in the Yukon, our best example of sustaining Indigenous knowledge in the area of research is in the find of Quade Nsinchi, the long ago man found in the ice near the Ruby Mountain Range in 1999. And this find led to co-managed science and culture tables here in the Yukon. It led to pathways to understanding Indigenous identity using mitochondrial DNA. And also from the cultural perspective that Quade Nsinchi was buried, he was not left for science and probing eyes and minds forever. He had a 40-day smoking party and a proper burial and a potlatch. So that in essence was a co-managed science and Indigenous table. So Indigenous investigation in science is tied to balance. In Tlingit systems, we have two moieties, both the wolf and the raven. And when the two sides, the clan stories are in alignment, we know that there's truth. So we don't say they match, but they are in alignment. There's some element of them fitting together in some way. Then we know that there's probably some truth there. We also know that knowledge is tied to ownership. It's tied to spirit. It's tied to the seen and unseen, to the known and the unknown. And that when you work with Indigenous tables, you have to realize that we also need time to deal with systemic discrimination. So besides asking your questions, that time and that need to embrace language, culture, and policy will be on the forefront. And when these things come up, there will also be memories and dialogue concerning the past treatment of Indigenous peoples here in our part of the world. So sustaining Indigenous knowledge means allowing time and funneling resources for people in communities to reconcile with their histories and languages amongst themselves. And this is largely due to acts of colonization. And that really we think that the co-production of knowledge occurs after Indigenous peoples have had time to go away and discuss the matters at hand. And through this process of internal dialogue, Indigenous research will form the basis of further work in articulating what Indigenous knowledge is for the purpose of influencing Indigenous lives, public schooling, and other areas of research. How is it resilient? That the facilitator, the researcher is a facilitator of knowledge, not a keeper of knowledge. So, you know, that goes against, again, about publishing. As researchers, we feel in the Western Hemisphere that we feel that we need to keep this knowledge, that we're the ones portraying it. But when it comes down to Indigenous knowledges, we realize that we are facilitators of knowledges and not keepers of it. Languages, especially because the details of our actions are found in our languages. It's also eco-specific, meaning it's place-based. That knowledge is tied to the unknown. So Western science, you always have to know. In our way of knowing, it's okay to not know. It also addresses Indigenous ceremonies. So these ceremonies include prayer or whatever else. If we make a mistake, there's certain things that need to be done and redone. And these are things that we do in the name of research. And, you know, it doesn't matter if there's a timeline. If it has crossed something and it's not right, we will make it, we will fix it right at the time because of the harm it may cause to our population in the future. That cultural ethics and protocols are adhered to, is carried forward and is based on the past and knows that Indigenous stories are true. So one of the things is that we basically have moved away from this idea of our stories being myth. Indigenous laws and protocols for working with our culture, that the highest level of authority is for Hoshaganya, which is our Heavenly Father. So I know that in science and research and all of that, that spirituality is not a large part of what you do, what we do, but in Indigenous constructs and in working in our communities, that is first and foremost. Everything has a spirit. So even when we're thinking about rocks or things that are inanimate to you, we understand that they do also have a spirit, and that we devote research time to what is sacred. So just taking the time out to examine, you know, the sacredness of things and the land and all of that. And to embody Indigenous research agendas, Indigenous peoples need research support and space to explore and teach Indigenous constructs amongst themselves, in order to collectively reconnect and reconcile with their own heritage, their ancestors, land, languages, methods, and philosophies. So More tips for sustaining Indigenous knowledge, celebrate and showcase the teller and carrier of Indigenous knowledge. Research should not be viewed as supporting, not replacing Indigenous knowledge holders. So what I mean by this is that often we'll go into a library and we'll see that the researcher is being celebrated for what they brought forward. It's not the Indigenous knowledge that is at the center, it is actually the supporting work. And so that is another thing that we need to do in our institutions of learning, is do a better job of basically supporting the Indigenous knowledge holder and showing the supports to be that they are supporting that. And so involving the community right from the start, even as you formulate your questions. So in that formulation, then you would also embrace the questions that the community may have. And do not simplify or generalize local Indigenous knowledges. So sometimes it's easier just to go online and find something, but it really doesn't serve any purpose if you do that, especially when we think about sustaining Indigenous knowledges. Authenticate the research and the questions with the community that you will be working with. So really, I think, I've taken up my time, and it's really fast. It's just a very quick view into the thoughts in my head with regard to this topic. I'd like to thank you for the time to discuss how we might sustain Indigenous knowledges in the Arctic. And given contact and colonization, there is a need for Indigenous peoples to go away and deliberate what their research questions will be. There's also a need to funnel your resources. So the resources that you get, also that parts of it need to be put aside for those community deliberations and what their questions might be, and allowing time for healing and ceremony in our own lands. So thank you again, very fast. Sorry about that. Thanks.
Thank you, Norma. It was very fascinating, very interesting. And now, and we already have questions, but we'll reserve them for later. So now we have our next speaker, and Chief Vyacheslav Shadrin will be speaking in Russian. So please select your language. You have the option on the bottom to select if you want English translation, that's English. If you would like to hear it in Russian, please go to Russian language to make sure you do that. Otherwise, you won't hear anything. So Chief Vyacheslav Shadrin is the chairperson of the Yukagir Council of Elders in the Republic of Sakha-Yakutia in Russia. He is also vice president of the Russian Association of Indigenous Peoples of the North, Raipon, in Yakutia. Chief Shadrin has been instrumental in supporting Yukagir's land and language for many years, and also been a prominent leader of the Indigenous Peoples movement in Russia. Chief Shadrin is also a research fellow in the Institute of Humanities and Indigenous Studies of the North in the Siberian branch of the Russian Academy of Sciences. He's an expert on Indigenous rights, ethnology, climate change, traditional land use, language, and culture. Please, Vyacheslav, floor is yours.
Здравствуйте, уважаемые участники нашего мероприятия Ходомадоемот Чамоджиканмапол. Я сегодня остановлюсь на вопросах современной ситуации и перспективах использования, сохранения традиционных знаний в России. Но я так понимаю, что эта тема будет актуальна, я думаю, и для всех других регионов нашей земли. И хотел бы сказать, что самое основное, к сожалению, пока у нас сохраняется колониальный подход к традиционным знаниям. И это выражается в разных системах. Посмотрим, наверное, две самых основных системы. Первая – это система образования, система передачи знаний. К сожалению, до сих пор у нас наша система, государственная система образования, она не учитывает наших традиционной системы воспитания, не учитывает наших традиционных знаний, тех традиционных отношений, которые есть внутри наших сообществ. детские сады, школы, посмотрите, до сих пор очень мало школ, где языком обучения являются языки наших народов. Практически очень мало школ, где изучаются традиционные знания наших народов. И это, к сожалению, является такой для нас вызовом. Конечно, мы пытаемся работать в этом направлении, менять ситуацию. К примеру, у нас есть национальные школы, у нас есть недавно, вот уже лет 10, как появились кочевые школы, в которых мы пытаемся учитывать это все, но их, к сожалению, пока очень мало. То есть нам еще предстоит сделать очень много. И, к сожалению, практически у нас не учитываются наши традиционные знания в системе профессионального образования. В колледжах и университетах. У нас буквально по всей России можно насчитать 1, 2, 3 только высших учебных заведений, университетов, где так или иначе изучаются языки наших коренных народов, где изучаются наши традиционные знания. И вторая система, конечно, о которой мы сегодня говорим, это наука. И здесь мы опять-таки видим, что подходы остаются пока в основном старыми. Самый главный базовый основной подход к носителям традиционных знаний – это до сих пор они лишь только носят вспомогательный характер. Они являются объектами исследований. Хотя носители традиционных знаний, они должны быть субъектами таких исследований, должны быть партнерами ученых. Следующее – методологический и ментальный подход. До сих пор традиционные знания носят только лишь вспомогательный характер. Чаще всего это только инструмент для подтверждения или построения различных там научных концепций. Чаще всего эти традиционные знания оцениваются совсем носителями совершенно другого мировоззрения. И очень часто они носят вот только лишь вспомогательный характер, к сожалению. В-третьих, чаще всего цель этих исследований – это решение совершенно других каких-то задач, в том числе, может быть, научных, общих и так далее. Но развитие самих коренных народов чаще всего носит в этих исследованиях второстепенный характер, лишь вспомогательный. А ведь на сегодняшний момент мы все говорим о необходимости устойчивого развития коренных народов, об их развитии и научном обеспечении этого устойчивого развития. И поэтому задача вот как раз носители традиционных знаний как раз должна играть вот в этом изучении, исследовании, развитии, устойчивом развитии наших народов должна играть очень большую роль. Следующее, до сих пор сохраняется неравенство. В чем это выражается? Чаще всего носители традиционных знаний, они лишь только информанты для ученых. Они равные исследования. Они равные исследователи. В чем это выражается? Посмотрите, пожалуйста, за кем сохраняется интеллектуальная собственность большинства исследований, монографий, словарей, в которых в том числе в качестве информантов принимали участие наши носители. Чаще всего собственниками являются ученые. Авторство. Очень мало работ, где наши информанты включены соавторами. К сожалению, это пока обычное явление в нашей научной среде. Посмотрите, какие гонорары. Опять-таки неравенство в оплате, участие вот в этих научных исследованиях. То же самое посмотрите участие в научных и других мероприятиях, где представляются результаты этих исследований. Опять-таки мы видим, что представителей традиционных знаний, тех, которые принимали в той или иной степени участие вот в этих исследованиях, на этих мероприятиях очень мало. Ну и последнее я бы хотел сказать все-таки о системе подготовки исследователей, носителей традиционных знаний. К сожалению, на сегодняшний момент практически такой системы нет. Существует академическая система подготовки знаний, аспирантура и так далее, вот другие системы. Она очень бывает сложная и чаще всего не учитывает именно носителей традиционных знаний. И вот когда я говорю о сопроизводстве знаний, то нам необходимо как раз поменять вот эти вот самые подходы, о которых только что я вам сказал. Только после изменения этих подходов, этой ситуации, мы только тогда сможем говорить о сопроизводстве знаний. К сожалению, мы продолжаем играть по навязанным нам правилам, правила, которые нам кто-то установил. В результате мы потеряли образ жизни, мы теряем наши территории, язык, культуру, хозяйство. Но, тем не менее, мы пока еще сохранили себя, но мы продолжаем, вот что очень опасно, мы продолжаем терять наше мировоззрение, мы продолжаем терять наши традиционные знания. И это главный для нас вызов на сегодняшний день. Не хотелось бы заканчивать свое выступление на негативной ноте. Почему я верю в будущее наших народов? Главное, наверное, то, что я, наверное, скажу о 4 факторах. Сегодня наши права, права коренных народов получили признание на международном уровне. Действует постоянный форум коренных народов, есть экспертный механизм по нашим правам. Посмотрите, в Арктическом совете коренные народы являются постоянными участниками и так далее. Но надо идти дальше и добиваться имплементации международных норм на национальном и местном уровне. Второе, наконец-то везде у нас мы наблюдаем в том, что начинает внедряться принцип свободного, предварительного и осознанного согласия коренных народов. Пусть этот процесс идет пока медленно, пусть не везде, но мы пока находимся в начале пути, но я верю в то, что этот принцип все-таки будет использоваться шире, в том числе и в научных исследованиях. В-третьих, наши традиционные знания получают признание и научного сообщества. Сегодня все больше и больше ученых, которые признают значимость традиционных знаний, проявляют свое уважение. Но этого пока недостаточно. Я думаю, что нам все больше и больше необходимо внедрять принцип «ничего о нас без нас». И это необходимо для того, чтобы действительно традиционные знания признавались во всем мире. И я думаю, что вот у нас скоро начнется международное десятилетие языков коренных народов. Я думаю, нам необходимо воспользоваться возможностями, которые предоставляются этим международным десятилетием для того, чтобы активно продвигать вот именно признание и традиционных знаний, и внедрять сопроизводство этих знаний. Ну и самое главное в том, что в каждом из наших детей, в это мы верим, есть душа и знания его предков. И наша задача вот в этой ситуации детям помочь, во-первых, самое главное, верить в себя, не чувствовать себя человеком второго сорта и создавать возможности, чтобы он вспомнил и гордился своими знаниями. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you very much, Vyacheslav Ivanovich. It was wonderful, of course, and very insightful. I think it really sets a good basis for our discussion. And again, we have a few questions that some of them are being answered in the Q&A, but please keep posting them. And when the panel convenes in a few minutes, we will hopefully have an opportunity to go over some of those questions. So now we go into the second phase of our session, which is a talking circle that would tackle the issues of indigenous knowledge and of co-production. And so we have a number of participants in the talking circle, and I just briefly introduce them. And then I let Norma describe the rules and lead the way in that talking circle. So in addition to Norma and Chief Shadrin that you already know, we have the following participants who were able to connect today. It's Gunn-Britt Retter, who lives in coastal Sami community in northeastern Norway, and she has worked on Arctic environmental issues in many capacities, but including now as the head of Arctic and Environmental Unit of the Sami Council. Yvonne Peter is a Gwich'in from Alaska, where he previously served the tribal chief. Currently, in addition to his service to the Gwich'in Council International Board, he also the Vice Chancellor for Rural Community and Native Education at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. Then Liza Mack serves as Executive Director of the Aleut International Association. She was born and raised in Aleutians and has over 20 years experience working with Indigenous organizations around Alaska and the world. She received her PhD just a few years ago from UAF, University of Alaska Fairbanks. Colleen Strawhacker is a program director at the Arctic Sciences section of the Office of the Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. And her focus is developing a project to support cyber infrastructure for convergent data-driven approaches to understand climate change, understand food security, and work with governance of indigenous data. Unfortunately, Julie and Victoria couldn't connect today, so but if they emerge during the discussion, we of course will be happy to see them. So now I give the floor to Norma, and I guess we could ask all the participants to turn on their cameras. And Norma, please take the lead on the talking circle. Norma, you would like to turn on your microphone.
Sorry, had to just throw in a little humor there. This is the first ever a virtual talking circle internationally. Usually when we're in a circle, in a talking circle, we're sitting together in a circle, of course, and sometimes we have an object in our hands and sometimes we don't, but we always go in the direction of the sun, which is left to right. And so that's how we're going to go today. So our first speaker will be Yvonne, then Liza, Slava, Gunbrick, and then Colleen. So our questions, and so part of the rules of the talking circle is that, you know, we don't interject, and I won't be interfering with your answers or adding anything. We leave them as they are. There's that kind of respect for that. And the questions, I think you all have gotten sent to you. So what is the role, the importance, diversity, and ways to respect and sustain the Indigenous knowledge when addressing resilience and sustainability in the Arctic, which is our first question. And then 2, how do we walk together in the right direction on our journey to co-produce, and what are the steps forward? So pretty loaded, and yeah, we'll just start in the direction that we indicated. And what I will do is turn my camera off only because I have low bandwidth. And I'm sometimes I might get bumped out. So we will start with Yvonne.
Masicho, Shalatnai, Jikvangwinzi. Good morning. As mentioned, my name is Yvonne Peter. I come from the community of Vashainko, and in English they call it Arctic Village in northern Alaska. It's my pleasure to be here with all the other panelists and everyone who's joined us this morning. Especially others who might be on in the very early mornings or late nights of where you're at, so that we're able to connect in kind of this global way, because I think fundamentally these conversations and these issues are global in nature, certainly circumpolar, and we need to be connecting with each other as we advance our collective understanding and knowledge surrounding these issues. I want to thank the keynotes and those who shared in the video tube, as it set a really great foundation for the conversation. I know in just my opening remarks here, I want to speak a little bit to elaborate some on the points that were brought up. One of the points being that we have to understand, I think, the context in which we're operating and doing the work that we're doing within Indigenous communities because of the historic and ongoing efforts of colonization and assimilation, which I think were alluded to by previous presenters. Within our own communities, Indigenous communities, we are in an ongoing effort to be moving forward on multiple fronts that we have to understand, so that as we approach this co-production of knowledge, the uplifting of Indigenous knowledge and knowledge systems, and our collaboration and cooperation with one another, understanding the context that we're operating within. So within our communities, you know, very much we're on a journey that includes healing from some of the traumas associated with those histories. We're also in efforts of revitalization and of language, culture, while we have our elders that are with us that are the tremendous knowledge bearers of these systems, especially those knowledges embedded within our Indigenous languages. we're actively doing the work to be sure that that knowledge is handed over to the next generation and captured and then shared. And so these efforts of revitalization, and then also within the broader context of the efforts toward justice and equity within our communities. And so when we think about the engagement within our communities, the collaboration between the different agencies, governments, organizations, understanding that broader context, I think, is really important, because then we understand why patience is so important, why there's a tremendous amount of diligence, and why, in particular, I think that for us to be effective in our partnerships and relationships, there needs to be longevity in our connections, in those relationships, in the work, and in that broader understanding that we bring forward to the table. Finally, I know I just was supposed to have a couple of minutes in my opening. I want to speak to the fact that, you know, the Indigenous knowledge systems are holistic in nature, and therefore really our approach to how we engage and build Indigenous knowledge, I think, also has to come from that holistic perspective. So when I think about that from within a context of an Indigenous community, our elders' presence is critical for being able to provide their wisdom, insight, and in particular, dependent on what the knowledge base that we're working on when we're talking about the collaboration with Western science and Indigenous knowledge, having the right folks around the table in those conversations, also being sure to include our youth, both because of their fresh perspective, but also because then there's also those learning opportunities for our people at a younger age, having our leaders at the table and a part of the conversation, because they're the ones responsible primarily for maintaining that accountability back to our communities, to our knowledge systems, to our people. And then finally, because we have this growing number of Indigenous professionals who are also becoming technical experts in different areas, having them engaged, because a lot of times they end up being serving in roles as intermediaries to making sure that the communication challenges that often arise are able to be bridged. So I'll just stop with my opening comments on those notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Yvonne. I don't think we have Julie on, do we? Okay, Liza.
We couldn't connect this morning.
Okay, Liza.
Kilamikam na everybody. Luke Tatua Sakta Cooking. My name is Liza Mack. I'm the Executive Director for Allied International Association. And I'd just like to share a couple of thoughts about the question that was posed to us about why Indigenous knowledge is important. Indigenous knowledge plays a role in providing detailed and learned experiences in intergenerational knowledge. Language plays a key role in this, as we've actually heard from several others, and I think we'll continue to hear this because it is very important and it's embedded in a lot of what we do and know. I think that this is held, there's a worldview that's held within our knowledge systems, and it encompasses not only how we approach the world, but how we move around within it, I guess is one way to say it. I think that a lot of times as you translate out of our Indigenous languages, a lot of the things that we have and the way that we approach things becomes objectified, where you have things that are looked at from a holistic perspective, where things are alive, where things are negotiated within that system. When you take it out of there and you take away that that life from it, it becomes something that can be owned and that can be compromise in some regard. In Unangam Tanu, as with other places, we have ways that we actually think about these things and think about them in a holistic perspective. So it just really sets an entirely different approach to how we look at society and how we look at culture. So when we think about sustainability and resilience, it requires input from the Indigenous communities and from the knowledge holders within that to help define how different things have been moving around within that system. I'm sorry, you know what? I actually went through the participant list and it made me really nervous because I'd like to, a lot of the people who are not only in this panel, but a lot of the people who are watching this webinar are really, I feel like everybody here brings a whole lot to the table. And And so being part of this panel and being able to speak to all of you in this sense is, it's really overwhelming kind of, but so I wrote down a whole bunch of things and it just kind of thrown me off. But really what I would like to say is just that the way that Indigenous knowledge plays a role in research and in how we approach our work, I think can't be overstated. I think that it should be considered in every part of research, in every part of resilience and sustainability. All of these things that we talk about and all these things kind of build not only on our cultures, but they have ripple effects into the future of our cultures. And so by being able to look back into the fabric of what actually builds our cultures and is the cornerstone of that, which is our environment and where we are, and the languages that we have within that are really important. And so that's why I think the role of Indigenous knowledge is in this sense. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Liza. We'll now move on to Slava.
Я считаю, что важность традиционных знаний заключается в том, что устойчивость всего человечества заключается в сохранении многообразия. Многообразие это и биологического, и культурного, лингвистического, и многих других. И это подразумевает в том числе, понятно, из уважения традиционных знаний. Если же говорить об инструментах, я, конечно, вот уже многое вот об этом уже говорил, но я просто добавлю на том, на чем я бы как бы не останавливался. У нас на сегодняшний момент совершенно отсутствует система поддержки носителей традиционных знаний, выявление и поддержка. Если вот академическая наука, у нас есть все-таки государственная система, есть финансирование и так далее, но нет такого. Есть отдельные попытки, есть отдельные частные инициативы и так далее, но нет государственной или какой-то такой системы поддержки носителей традиционных знаний. И, соответственно, вообще-то и понятие вот системы носителей и так далее, вот система традиционных знаний как таковой у нас отсутствует понятие. И нам надо задуматься, если мы хотим действительно сопроизводства знаний, равенства традиционных знаний с академической наукой, то мы должны думать и об этой системе поддержки тоже. Ну и, конечно, развитие, вот я уже говорил о двух принципах. Это принцип свободного, предварительного и осознанного согласия. И второй принцип, это обязательный принцип, что ничего не должно говориться о нас или исследоваться о нас без нас. То есть обязательное участие представителей традиционных знаний, носителей традиционных знаний в любых исследованиях, которые касаются наших народов. Ну и третий, наверное, инструмент, это инструмент обязательно интеллектуальной собственности, потому что наши традиционные знания, они являются собственностью наших народов, и, соответственно, они тоже имеют право на это сохранение. К сожалению, пока у нас в этом очень тоже пока слабо в этом направлении идет работа. Вот, наверное, вкратце я об этом скажу, потому что я и так много уже выступал.
Thank you, Slava. Now we will go to Gunbert. Gunbert, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Diarvoda Samis Burekit. Greetings from Sápmi. A lot is said already, and so I tried to choose an aspect to share with you today. There are many declarations stating that decisions for the Arctic need to be based on best available knowledge. So knowledge is thus informing decision makers to prepare the society at large to address resilience and sustainability in the Arctic, challenges caused by both climate changes and environmental changes. There are, of course, a whole lot of other things too, but that's the focus here. The motivation is, of course, to prepare their societies to live through existing and prepare for future changes and challenges. So this is all good. In Sápmi, the Sami areas, however, we experience that some of these decisions taken to address these changes are also massive change of land use that is utilizing both reindeer pastures or fishing grounds for production of green energy, for example. So for us in the Sami culture, the decisions taken to address climate change and is built upon science and knowledge production. And these decisions taken by the larger society is in fact harming the foundation for Sami culture. I wouldn't say it's bad science, but it's a science based on the dominant culture's needs. Decisions taken might not provide the full picture or is neglecting the societal needs of the indigenous peoples or to improve indigenous lives. Sometimes, however, the decisions or the declarations say decisions should be based on best available knowledge, both science and indigenous knowledge. So this is very good. And several of you have already stated that there is an increased recognition of indigenous peoples and our rights and our cultures. And then there's also a recognition that we have different needs and we also have solutions to addressing resilience and sustainability in the Arctic, as well as climate and environmental changes. So it is a recognition, it is also recognition of indigenous knowledge as knowledge system that has informed decisions for our cultures based on generations of experience embedded in our languages and livelihoods and are still there today. So this, I just chose to focus on this to show that we are gaining recognition. We still have a lot to do, and we need to build the Arctic societies together, not at a cost of each other. So I think I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gunn-Britt. Now we are going to move on to Colleen. And I think that's our last speaker, but we do have more names in our file. I'll talk to Andre. No, Colleen, you can go ahead, but you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now? Perfect. So first of all, thank you, Norma, for introducing me, and thank you to the organizers for having me here. I'm honored to sit on this panel and to engage in this conversation. I should be clear that I am not Indigenous. I am speaking from a Western scientific perspective, and I work for an organization that is funds basic research largely from a Western science perspective. But I do want to reiterate what has been said over and over again by the previous speakers, that I very much view Indigenous knowledge and Western science to both be critical knowledge systems to understanding the rapidly changing Arctic system and critical for adding to our decision-making processes that can lead to resilience and sustainability. I do think we have come a long way when it comes to increasing Indigenous voices in these processes, but I think I will also reiterate what other speakers have said, that we have a long way to go. For those of you who may not know about my role at the National Science Foundation, I'm a program officer, and what I do is I evaluate scientific proposals that come in. I find reviewers, I evaluate those reviews, and then I can recommend which projects are awarded or declined. And I also have, as a program manager, I manage those projects as well. And so what I can do in my role, at least, is to make sure that science principal investigators are respecting Indigenous knowledge in their project, that they are truly following a co-produced approach. And in that, I look for things like, is their budget allocated for Indigenous knowledge holders? Are they equal partners? Has the project been developed in partnership from the beginning? when they're proposing their research. Are ethics upheld when working with Indigenous knowledge? And this includes ethics in both working with Indigenous knowledge holders and also the Indigenous data sovereignty and governance mechanisms that I think are really important to follow. We have standards for Western scientific data. We need to follow those standards, which are very unique for Indigenous data as well. My comments are really mostly geared at the Western scientists on the call, but all too often I'll see a proposal come in that may have one letter of support from an Indigenous organization and the scientists will call it co-produced. That is not my definition of co-production. I think in looking at the definitions that are being in the Q&A, I think a lot of people would agree with me on that. So I think in my role as a program officer, I can help protect some of these processes and hold scientists to a standard in working with Indigenous communities. That being said, as a Western scientist, I'm always learning more. I always want input from other people, and I find these conversations really valuable. So I know there are a lot of questions going, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation. And again, thank you for having me on the panel.
Thank you very much, Colleen. I'm going to now turn the floor over to Andre for our next part. Thanks for taking part in our talking circle. Amazing.
Thank you, Norma. Thank you very much. Thanks to everyone. So now I think we have so many questions. I mean, just a lot of things to choose. So I just gonna read a couple of questions and maybe ask one or two panelists to respond so that we could cover some. But I just want to also reiterate that there is a way to respond in Q&A, and also that questions that I asked, some of them could also be responded by panelists later in the after the session. So an interesting question we received from Jeanette Coilsh, and she's asking, as an Indigenous person working in government, and you can also probably expand it in science, how do I further Indigenous knowledge into research, and where, of course, we face bias and discrimination? So how an Indigenous person, a scholar working in that system, could actually advance Indigenous knowledge and knowledge co-production? Any thoughts? And we again could go with the sun. So I guess if Yvonne wants to start.
Yeah, sure. It's funny, when I woke up this morning, I thought, gosh, I hope I get picked last to speak in each of the rounds. But of course, when you think like that, then you end up being thrown out first. But absolutely, I'm just wrapping up 6.5 years of service as a vice chancellor at a research university in the Arctic. And I will say it's not an easy lift. It's not an easy task to be an Indigenous scholar, an Indigenous leader within the context of a large bureaucratic system, whether that's government or academic. And I think every day is an effort that includes trying to educate your peers that are leaders, your peer employees within those institutions at all levels, from the highest level of administration, all the way to the staff that engage more directly, perhaps with community members. And I think there's a mix of approaches. Some are institutional transformation, where you're trying to drive at policy and regulation change that require the institutions, for example, to provide more comprehensive training about Indigenous history, knowledge, context, or where you implement required protocols for different functions within those institutions. And when you look back at some of the history of the work within an Indigenous context that was alluded to by other speakers, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples within the UN, for example, you're looking at 20 to 30-year efforts of educating, building understanding knowledge and awareness, and then moving forward with some of those changes in the implementation. And I think that's the magnitude of some of the challenges that we have ahead of us in these conversations. Is there's no shortcut to get to the end result that we're hoping to achieve with this uplifting of Indigenous knowledge and implementing protocols that recognize and adhere to the ethics that come from our Indigenous communities and worldviews and knowledge systems. And so so that's a part of this work that's before us that we really need to be doing and focusing on. And we need others to be helping us because all the burden can't be shouldered by Indigenous peoples ourselves.
Thank you very much. Do we have anyone else interested? Maybe Colleen wants to say a few words.
Sure, I was typing an answer to another question, so it was hard for me to keep my attention on multiple things, but I do just want to say too that what I see from Western scientists often as well is that they think that doing co-production or working with Indigenous scholars is easy, that it's not a rigorous methodology, that it doesn't take a long time to build those relationships. And this has been frustrating for me to see. You know, in Western science, we have people who take years and years and years to get a PhD. They do a lot of background literature and reading in a specific topic, but they don't feel the need to do the same when thinking about co-produced approaches or working with Indigenous scholars. So I think it's really important to see these approaches as rigorous, that they take time, that these relationships take time, especially given the history of colonization that we have been talking about over the past hour. And just to reiterate again that it takes a lot of time to think about these things, and that we should be thinking about them the same way we think about other scientific disciplines in a lot of ways, that they are rigorous approaches, and that there's a lot of information out there that you can take advantage of to read, instead of, again, putting all of the pressure on your Indigenous colleagues to teach you about these things over and over again.
Yes, thank you very much. So another really interesting question comes from Clara Welch, who is asking Indigenous knowledge holders on the panel. So how they view that insights of Indigenous knowledge are transferable in different locations or from place to place. So when we talk about Indigenous knowledge is place-based, how do we work with transferring or making some maybe more general conclusions from or some knowledge, general knowledge, drawing from what we know from different places? So how do we transfer, if we can, from different places to develop knowledge of general global sustainability? We can maybe start with Liza.
Thank you for that. I think that this kind of this actually works with the question from Jeanette, and kind of what I had kind of jotted down about co-production of knowledge just in itself, and kind of what Yvonne has just said, and Colleen as well. But really, I think that it does take time to learn about these Indigenous structures and what co-production actually means, and how these knowledge systems work together, and kind of unlearn this dominant approach that we've had to science and to research over time. Research really translates into policy in a lot of places, and that's what, you know, our work kind of at the Arctic Council does, you know, and building on the things that we're doing. And so having a voice that builds into that research, that then allows us to continue Indigenous ways of life are really important. And so it is place-based, but it's also relevant in other places. And what we've found, you know, what you do find across the North and across Indigenous cultures is that a lot of our problems are very similar. There's a lot of infrastructure deficit. There is a lot of language loss and cultural practices that are being lost because of policy, because of environmental changes, because of climate. And so even though they may seem like they're very different, you know, a lot of the things that are happening can be seen across many cultures and across many ecosystems. And so not just what that research is, but how it's being brought back to a community, and making sure that the knowledge and the research and the things that are being done are actually communicated back to the people, and how they use that is something that can be translated across different places, for sure.
Thank you, Liza, very much. I mean, whether Vyacheslav, would you like to respond to this? So how do we transfer knowledge, or whether it is transferable Indigenous knowledge between different places, countries, and continents? And just remind me to
Я бы
switch.
хотел сказать, Да, я хотел вот сказать о передаче традиционных знаний. В принципе, и совместное производство знаний. Это, конечно, сопроизводство подразумевает равенство, то есть обязательно наличие второй стороны. Он должен быть не объектом, он должен быть субъектом, он должен быть участвовать в этом производстве. Чаще всего мы пока, когда говорим о сопроизводстве, есть ученые, которые используют информантов, может быть, еще что-нибудь, и вроде бы с учетом, учитывая иногда их мнение, они производят какое-то исследование. А когда мы говорим о сопроизводстве, должно быть две равных стороны. То есть это совершенно равные стороны. Вы понимаете? То есть это подразумевается, что все коллективы, которые занимаются научные и так далее, команды, там, научные центры и так далее, они должны включать, привлекать к себе этих носителей традиционных знаний. Все научные гранты, которые направлены на территории, где проживают коренные народы и так далее, они должны учитываться вот при, опять, вовлеченность носителей традиционных знаний в проведении этих исследований. Конечно, еще задается вопрос, а как можно найти этих традиционных? У нас нет системы, вот как в академической науке, там, где есть степени разные, есть какие-то объединения и так далее. У носителей традиционных знаний, к сожалению, этого нету. Нет какой-то, во-первых, нет системы, ни какой-то платформы и так далее, которая бы их, может быть, объединяла или еще что-то делала. И говорю, нет системы их поддержки вообще. Вот нам стоит об этом задуматься. И я думаю, что вот наша сегодняшняя дискуссия как раз ставит эти вопросы, пока, возможно, готовых ответов нету, будут разные предложения, разные пути и так далее, но мы должны делать эти шаги, если мы должны идти к сопроизводству. Не просто к передаче кому-то знаний, нет, а сопроизводство. Потому что я, например, считаю, что передача этих знаний и так далее, это опять немножко отражает старый подход, когда мы кому-то отдали, и тот использует его. Ничего подобного. Совместно. Сопроизводство. Вот что должно быть.
Thank you, Chief Shadrin. Thank you very much. I guess, again, there's many questions. One of them from Yelena Aldasheva, and I address it to Gunbrit first, and then others could chime in as well. What are the best ways for non-Indigenous scientists to prepare themselves to work with Indigenous communities and co-production? I mean, this question, as you know, appears in various forms. What are the ways to find and access best practices, where to look to start? I think it's a very important question for a lot of the members of the scientific community. So I guess I could start with Gunbrit, but others could also discuss that if they want. Please, Gunbrit.
Yes, thank you for that question. It's a key. It's a challenging one. We often also see the need of developing protocols or guidelines, science guidelines, and so on. And some communities have that already. So the first step would be to check with the community in question to see if there are existing protocols that they need to apply to, or if talking about apply, maybe they even have to apply for a permission from the Indigenous community to come and visit. But a lot of those are also under development, kind of research guidelines and so on. So look for those. But I also think there is a need to invest in time to build trust and respect and identify key actors or some in that community. But also saying this, I'm also aware there is a risk of overload of requests to these key people. So we also have to figure out ways of how to meet scientists and researchers. So I don't think there is yet a complete answer to that, but trust and respect and invest in time to develop relationships. But I have to add also that Sami Council has written a pre-paper or something about co-creating research projects where we share some personal experiences between Sami Council and Arctic researchers, and a paper that we are developing with Arctic Center University of Groningen, an Austrian Polar Research Institute, and Nolan Research Institute. So where we also are plundering with those same questions or trying to answer them.
Thank you very much, Gunn-Britt. I was wondering whether any other panelists, maybe Norma could say a few words if she can hear us.
Hi, yes, I can. I guess for me, where I come from, it would be just to, come in and sit down, pull up a chair. That's how it starts. Really, it's as simple as that. And from that, that there's all kinds of processes that emerge from that, that the relationship that you're seeking, the protocols that you're asking for, the language, the space, the spirituality, all of these things are going to emerge. And you can't get them from books. You really do need to sit down with the group that you're going to be working with and ask that question. How do you want me to engage with you? That would be the simplest way. Because to go at it from any other way is to not really be directed. And we no longer have time in our communities to, to spread ourselves really thin. Because one of the things, that we want to do in our communities is to pay more attention to Indigenous knowledges and to recognize that it may be relevant in other places. And that generally we do not generalize. So I will not bring in a Cree construct to a Tlingit construct and make it mine. Cree is Cree, Tlingit is Tlingit, and that's the way we look at it. But there is a place where the two ideas kind of come together and that we can share some common ground. And that, I think, is what we look for, is that general area of commonality and work towards those endeavors. So anyway, a long way of answering a very simple question. Thank you for including me.
Thank you, Norma. It's an excellent answer. And I think it's the question that, as I said, a lot of members of science community, but also our colleagues in the Indigenous community are working with right now, and where a lot of efforts is directed. Maybe it's actually maybe our last question. And again, we have many questions Q&A, so if panelists could have a chance to reply. But maybe our last question, which is also related to the previous one, is how do we introduce Indigenous knowledge into curriculum, and that students across the world could learn and could understand those important things that we're discussing today? What would be your thoughts on that? Again, maybe Yvonne, we could start, and then one more person, and we have to wrap up pretty soon. Thank you.
Yeah, so I want to actually, I think there's a segue between several comments that I want to connect actually in my response here. One is that, to that last question for the role of non-Indigenous scholars, I think put it in the context of if you were going to go and conduct research in Nigeria, for example, you'd probably want to learn about the history, the context of the nation. You definitely want to research the laws and regulations or protocols that are in place so that you adhere to all of those. But because of the history of colonization, that same respect is not offered to Indigenous communities and Indigenous nations. And I think that's just a framework that I'd like to put out there. That there's work and effort that certainly needs to go in addition to, I think, the really great guidance that Norma and others provided as well. But I also think that connects to another point that was made by Slava in that there are not mechanisms of support in place to provide the opportunity for Indigenous communities to have the capacity to be able to fully engage in this work and these efforts. We're still in a context, just for example, as a board member of the Gwich'in Council International, and it's true for all of the rest of the Gwich'in Council International board members, we all have full-time plus other jobs that we need to work, and we're volunteering, oftentimes having to take leave from our normal job in order to engage in the Arctic Council Forum or in these sorts of conversations and efforts. So it's a significant added effort for us to be able to afford to be involved while also working to maintain our own cultural practices, our own participation in the revitalization and healing and other work that I mentioned that we're engaged in. And so I think that we need to recognize that institutions, government institutions, research agencies, and academia and other institutions that are involved in this work need to build in mechanisms to be able to provide that support for our communities to be able to be engaged and to have equitably respected roles, to be able to participate and engage, so that it's no longer the expectation that Indigenous knowledge bearers and Indigenous peoples and communities are not only just being mined for knowledge and information, but also that we're afforded the opportunity to be supported in a way that we're able to engage. I mean, as you can imagine, if all of the other researchers had to not work their regular jobs as researchers and volunteer to do all of this research activity, it is untenable situation, yet that's there. Finally, in direct response to the question on how do we bring Indigenous knowledge into the curricula and into academia, I think that there's multiple ways in which that can happen. I think it's a critical moment right now for us to, as was brought up by a previous speaker, get education that's happening through the medium of our languages, so that knowledge is naturally embedded in there, especially at the K-12 or preschool age. And at the university level, examples at UAF that we do have in place, for example, in our counseling training program, we ensure that an Indigenous elder is always present as a co-instructor with the faculty. So the students are being immersed in both kind of Western perspective and knowledge and understanding related to counseling, but also the Indigenous perspective and knowledge. And so that co-instruction happens through the context, and the framework has been informed by elders over the years. So it actually is immersed in an Indigenous methodology for healing and training for counseling. So that's an example of how to bring those together.
Yvonne, thank you very much. Well, I mean, we are coming to the closing of this segment of the Talking Circle. I think, again, I would like to thank everyone for participating, thank everyone for sending their wonderful questions. And again, their answers are being typed as we speak right now in the chat. I see our panelists are typing. So that's, thank you again for doing that, and thank you for sending questions. Of course, it's just in 90 minutes, talking about Indigenous knowledge and co-production is not enough. It needs a lifetime, of course, to understand and to work together. But we hope that this conversation has been helpful and has been inspiring, at least it was to me. And it's a lot of voices that we heard that really are telling us important things and sharing with us their personal experience, what is most valuable. From myself as a scientist, as a president of IASA, of course, you all know that IASA has always been striving to provide platform to bring together meaningful conversation between knowledge systems. And we acknowledge, recognize, and demand that these systems are treated as equitable by funding agencies, by institutions, and by scientists. So that's, of course, an important principle that we all share, I hope, in this room, but also it is a guideline for us to work on this further, not to just talk about it, to implement and do concrete things such as enforce and introduce principles for ethical conduct that include many of those things that we just heard, and that keep our colleagues accountable in academia and public research and policy sector for making sure that they are not only saying things, but they are doing things. But I also would like to ask Norma to provide a closing comments, and then we go to Joel, who will talk a little bit about Arctic Resilience Forum, since it's the final session of that wonderful event. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to the panelists, and for answering the questions that we put forward. Also, in this whole idea of sustaining Indigenous knowledges in our institutions of higher learning, or even in our research, it brought forward some very important points, and I really appreciated the perspectives from the Arctic region, Indigenous people speaking for themselves. And, you know, I think one of the ways, of course, that we can embrace as Indigenous peoples academia, and I do teach in the institutions, you know, so looking at the institutions' learning outcomes, recognizing that they may ask us to embrace Indigenous knowledges, but what is missing is the respect for the culture as we do, and that is brought forward in the languages in the best of our ability, and all of these other things that that you have heard being talked about today. And again, thank you so very much for allowing me to be a part of this panel. I truly enjoyed connecting with you all via Zoom. I sure do miss being with you all face to face. But thanks again, and over and out.
Wow, what a discussion that was. Thanks so much, Norma and Andre. Thanks to all the speakers for your insight today. That was a fantastic session, and your efforts to draw a map toward getting us to getting co-production right are just invaluable. Cannot say enough about that session. We're truly honored to have such an expert team. Your thoughts on history, equity, holistic approaches, education, and your recommendations were just invaluable. Now, this forum has featured some lively conversations among experts on everything from energy to health and infrastructure. In the process, we've observed that understanding the enabling conditions and the interconnections among all these issue areas is the real key to resilience. And Indigenous knowledge is one of the most consistent threads through all of the previous sessions of the Resilience Forum. And the sessions have really embraced that. Nearly half of the speakers, actually 49% of the speakers in this year's Resilience Forum are Indigenous. It was no accident also that the series began with a session on Indigenous youth leadership and concluded with a session on Indigenous knowledge. And jumping back to that youth session, I remember how Jordan Peterson, a Gwich'in speaker, described the way Indigenous knowledge allowed his elders to slide back through time. As the Arctic transforms and grows more uncertain, it's now necessary to slide forward through time to set a vision for a resilient Arctic and establish milestones to get there. And sessions like this one really help us to do that. So it's a little sad to come to the end of such a successful series, but we're not done. The momentum and collaboration that sprung up throughout the forum will continue. The organizers and speakers, and I should note there were about 120 organizers and speakers throughout the duration of this forum, are going to work together to generate a concluding report that's going to go to the Sustainable Development Working Group in the Arctic Council. And that's going to be, we hope, an actionable resilience blueprint with next steps for implementing the Arctic Resilience Action Framework and building out this community of practice. So that's going to happen. And also stay tuned for a public session in the spring that'll keep you apprised and keep up the momentum. So huge thanks to the speakers and panelists, the organizing committee for this session, the 9 sessions that came before, and all of you for joining and asking a ton of great questions. Remember the Slack channel so you can keep this conversation going. This session in particular, I think there'll be a lot of follow-up. I want to send a special thanks to the Icelandic chairmanship for hosting this whole series, to my co-convener, Jennifer Spence, the executive secretary for the Sustainable Development Working Group, and to the indomitable Brittany Janis, who expertly led all the organizing work behind the scenes. Stay tuned for our report and some next steps. And to finish this out, we want to play you a very short 2-minute or so video of highlights from the forum. So thanks so much for tuning in. Thanks for your work to build resilience in the North, and be safe and stay healthy. The Arctic region is transforming rapidly.
The speed of change makes adaptation challenging.
This makes resilience critical.
We come from a long line of very, very adaptable and resilient people.
The Arctic Resilience Forum invites ideas and discussion about how to build the resilience of Arctic communities and ecosystems.
looking at how we could use our traditional knowledge, our traditional food systems to develop our own resilience, to develop our own economies, and to develop also and maintain our pride in our cultures.
How do we help these communities not just sustain themselves, but what is needed to make them thrive?
Over 1,000 participants.
Close to 50 organizing partners.
The beauty of the Resilience Platform is it allows us to focus not just on issues,
but the interconnections among those issues.
This forum has provided a platform to discuss topics that are important to Arctic communities and draw connections between these topics under the umbrella of advancing Arctic resilience.
The pandemic demonstrates the importance of resilience by exposing long-standing vulnerabilities and affirming the strengths of Arctic communities.
Success depends on connecting the dots and working together.
Policy can be an extremely important and effective tool in change.
Both public and private sector funding needs to be there.
I believe that both the Indigenous knowledge and the Western knowledge have a lot to gain from one another.
The Arctic Resilience Forum has accelerated our progress towards a more resilient Arctic.
By linking efforts, establishing next steps,
and building communities of practice.
We have the world's eyes for a moment and ears. Now's the time to advance efforts that we have always thought were important.
Health, family, access, Indigenous knowledge, the land,
network,
housing,
internet,
local businesses, infrastructures,
clean water,
mental health,
communities,
communities.